Felix, I know your band, the Rascals, were managed by Sid Bernstein, the same guy who put together the Beatles' famous concert at Shea in '65.
Yes.
I heard he may have unintentionally upset some in the Beatles' entourage that night. What happened?
The Beatles did a press conference. You know, we were just starting out. Our manager kind of loaded the place. And a lot of fans kept asking rascal questions. And John didn't like it too much. Because after the third question, he said, "Is this a plot?" You know, he kind of knew that there was something up. So I was a little embarrassed by that. So lo and behold, here we are in the dugout. And all of a sudden, up on the scoreboard, our manager flashes a sign. The Rascals are coming. The Rascals are coming. The Rascals are coming. Well, at that time, Brian Epstein did not think that was such a great idea. He didn't like that at all. So he made him take it down immediately.
What did you think when you saw it? Were you excited?
Oh, we were flabbergasted. 55,000 people going absolutely, totally bananas over the Beatles. And up on the scoreboard, the Rascals are coming here to be, but he didn't like it too much.
The story of signing them was always very important. Paul, in particular, was the key, really, to my signing them and to the songs that he wrote. I thought he was the most talented. George had no particular strength or appearance, although he was talented. And of course, the drummer was just a drummer. And John was always strange. I never quite understood him and was never sure what he was going to say next. So Paul I related to more than the others and spent more time with.
John was working at the record plant. And one day the engineer, Dave Thorner, called me up and he said, "John wants to do a acoustic guitar overdub, but his strings are all shot on the guitar. We're planning on doing this. You guys have any strings down there?" And I was tracking a band, so we had everything we needed. So I brought him up a pack of acoustic guitar strings, and John said, "Oh, great, these work perfect, just what I use." He said, "Well, what do I owe you?" And I said, "Are you crazy? You know, you don't owe me anything for the strings." "No, what do I owe you?" "You don't owe me anything." Kept on insisting, and I said, "You know what? You know, when you get a minute, I could use an autograph for a friend of mine." He said, "No problem." So a couple of weeks go on. I forget about the autograph. I'm down on the first floor, still producing my record. And the receptionist from the record plant called me and she said, "John's out here and he's going to leave. He wants to say goodbye," knowing he wasn't going to come back for a while because his work was done. So I walked out and John said, "Well, I'm going to leave now. It was good to see you again. I didn't want to forget your friend. What was his name who wanted the autograph?" I said, "Carl," with a K. And he wrote on a record plant track sheet, he wrote, "To Carl, thanks for stringing me along. Dr. Winston O. Boogie," dated, drew a little picture of himself, John Lennon, and gave it to me. He thought the autograph was for the guy who gave him the strings. That's why he wrote, "Thanks for stringing me along." I said goodbye. He walked out the front door. You know, the guys that I was working with, a guy named Willie Nile who made records years ago, his whole band was in the studio, you know, like kind of peeking their heads around to get a glimpse of him. And when he walked out, I was standing there with the autograph. I was showing it to them and talking about how I used to work with him or whatever. And, you know, before we could even get back into the room, there was a TV up on the wall in the lobby, and we interrupt the show to bring you a news alert. John Lennon's just been shot outside, you know, his apartment at Dakota on 72nd Street. And we actually laughed because, you know, where do these people get the news? You know, he was just right here. And then as they talked a little bit more, we figured it out. Yeah, he got in the car. It's only 30 blocks away from 44th and 8th, you know. And I was still standing there with this piece of paper in my hand. So unless he wrote something in the limo, and to Yoko's recollection, there was nothing written, and she was the one with him. So this would be the last thing he wrote.
So the very last thing John Lennon wrote, what's his name?
Yeah.
As a musician, as a guitar player, one of my favorite moments was sitting with Paul in this castle, and we were both sitting there with acoustic guitars. And it was in between takes. and he starts playing Michelle. And I'm watching his fingers, and he goes to that second chord, and you know, I'd always thought that it was like a minor seventh, and he plays this really, you know, jazzy seventh sharp 9 chord, and it was like this big revelation to me that he was way more sophisticated in his musicianship than I ever gave him credit for. You know, you just don't, until you see it firsthand. I was a very big Beatles fan. I mean, I started playing guitar the week that I Want to Hold Your Hand was released. So to actually get to play with the Beatles was a unique experience.
Lawrence may have never heard I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. If Liverpudlian singer Billy J. Kramer, who John and Paul wrote many hits for, had gotten his wish one afternoon.
It was my 21st birthday. John came up to me and said, I've got a good song for you. And he played Bad to Me. And I said, I think it's a great song, John, you know. He said, I want to run something by you, you know, and tell me what you think of it. And he set up the piano in a room, just him and myself, and it was I Want to Hold Your Hand. He played I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I knew it was a smash. And I said, can I have it? He says, no, we're recording that ourselves next week.
As a young reporter with the New York Times in 1964, Robert was sent to Miami to cover a title fight between a young boxer named Cassius Clay, before he changed his name to Muhammad Ali, and the reigning world champion, Sonny Liston. Clay ended up winning the fight, becoming the heavyweight champion of the world. The Beatles happened to be in Miami at the same time, preparing for their second straight appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Robert was there when the Beatles met Clay.
Basically, the Beatles were on their first American tour. They wanted a photo op, but Liston didn't think they were worth his time. He thought they were a bunch of little sissies. But the British photographer who was with them was desperate for some sort of a picture, even when they were turned down by Liston. So he brought the limo to the 5th Street gym in what is now South Beach and kind of herded them into this splintery old gym, up the steps where Cassius Clay worked out, figuring that at least he'd get a photo with Clay. The Beatles, who were by this time understood what was happening, were very cranky and tried to leave. But the security guards herded the little Beatles, and they're rather small people, these Beatles, all into this damp old dressing shower room while waiting for Cassius Clay, whom I had never seen either. I thought maybe it would be a chance to interview them. I had kind of edged over to them, and I was herded into the shower dressing room with them, and the door was locked behind us. They were very angry now. They were cursing. Beatles can really curse. And I introduced myself very pompously as Robert Lipsyte from the New York Times, and John introduced himself as Ringo Starr. George was John, in a spirit of play. Then they kind of calmed down, and I asked them for their predictions. And basically, there was no doubt in their mind that Clay was a silly little overhyped wanker, and that Liston would destroy him. And then all of a sudden, the locked locker room door bursts open, and Cassius Clay fills the doorway. And the one thing I do remember from that moment is the 5 of us just absolutely gasped in unison. First of all, he was huge, and he was beautiful, and he was laughing his ass off. And he roared something like, I wrote it down, I think, hello there, Beatles. We ought to do some road shows together. We'll get rich. and bang, the mood in that little room just shifted. He just turned a switch. I mean, he absolutely turned them on. Everybody now kind of glowed. And like, 8th grade class trip, they followed Clay out of the dressing room, through the room, the crowd, and into the boxing ring. What happened next in the ring? they go through a routine that absolutely looks like they had rehearsed it. They go down on their hands and knees to pray to Clay, would stop hitting them. He picks up Ringo, and then they line up in kind of a domino effect, and Clay punches the first one, and they all go down like dominoes. That was the photo op, and then they all kind of danced out. It was breathtaking. Afterwards, Clay goes through his workout, the whole float like a butterfly, sting like a bee thing. And then at the end of the day, after his rub down, Cassius takes me aside because he had seen me in a locker room. And he said, "So who were those little faggots?" I explained to him that they were this hot group from Liverpool called the Beatles. This was the meeting of the 60s. The meeting of these two great icons that, you would have thought would have circled around each other or been prepped or waited to talk to. They really didn't know fully who the other was. And yet, there was that kind of instant connection that they could play. It was, it was thrilling. And even, I have to say, even at the moment, as clueless as I was then about, who they were, and of course, who could ever imagine what they would become, I just had that kind of electrical feeling that I had seen something, that something had happened.
The first time I met Paul, I walked into Henson, which used to be A&M Studios, walked into Henson and looked around, and there was people with English accents, but I didn't see Paul. And then a few minutes later, Paul walked in, and I met him and said, "Hi, I'm Rusty." I mean, I didn't say that, but I felt like I was saying that. And I'm Paul. How's it going? And then within like an hour or two, we were jamming, playing, and he's over there on his Hofner, and I'm playing guitar. It is quite surreal to think that it sort of, in a way, went full circle, because when I was 5, it brought up in La Habra, California. The first musical thing that I flipped out on was the Beatles. I never even thought I'd meet a Beatle, much less play with Paul. And then I have many moments like that in the last 8 or 9 years, up on stage, singing some cool Beatles part, or in the bus afterwards. That's kind of a nice moment, too. Your heart rate starts to slowly go down, sharing fun moments of the show and having a toast. Paul talking about old Beatles stories. I just like, how the hell did I get here?
I lived in a nice house in the country in Henley, which is about 30 miles outside of London, and about a mile away from Friar Park. And I got to know George from living out there gradually through all the other, it's rock star heaven out there,
Right.
And my wife then got to know all the wives, and I got to know Dave Gilmour living in the area, and eventually I met George, and I was going up to his house quite regularly, because he didn't go out that much, not that he needed to, because Friar Park was such a beautiful place to be, Mm-hmm. And so I got to know him pretty well, and we hang out in his studio and things like that. Anyway, I was going back and forth from America to Britain a lot. This was before I moved out. I lived in America for 15 years, but this was just before I moved out, so I was doing a lot of traveling. And I came back from Los Angeles one day, and of course jet-lagged, horribly, and trying to stay awake. But so I walked over to the local pub just for a pint of beer, and thinking, right now I'm going to have an early night and a nice rest and try and get over this jet lag. And the strangest thing, someone came into the pub. It was quiet in the pub, not too many people, and snuck up beside me, and I looked at it, and it was George. And he said, "Well, I called you home, and your wife said you were at the pub." And I said, "Well, what's going on?" And he said, "Well, there's nothing going on, and there's no one at home. Olivia's away, and I got nothing to do. What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I've got this horrible jet lag, and I'm just about to go home." He said, "Well, come up the house." I said, "Well, I'm really tired. I'm going to fall asleep." And he said, "Well, I got something that'll keep you awake. Don't worry." So I said, "Okay." So we went up to the house, and he started cooking some rice and some ginger and garlic and curry powder. We made a little curry meal, and we had that, and it was crazy. And it was we went up to the studio and fooled around there. And then I was still feeling pretty awake, and so was he. So we went into the large living room, and there was a few guitars scattered around. And George picked up a guitar and motioned for me to pick up a guitar as well. And he started playing Norwegian Wood on the guitar, right? And I thought, what's going on here? I'm sitting with George, and he's playing a Beatles song. You know, you wouldn't normally mention the Beatles when you're with George, you know. He's had enough of that. But he started playing, so I joined in a bit, and then he started playing a few other Beatles songs on the guitar, giving me this look, like an ironic look, as if to say, you know what you're getting here, you know, we're just messing around, but let's have some fun. And he didn't do any Paul McCartney songs. He did a couple of Lennon songs. Then he with his butterfly brain, sort of scattering from one thing to another, you know, he said, follow me. So we put down the guitars, and we went up through upstairs and through corridors and winding round and all that. And we came to this landing up on the second floor or something, the first floor, I can't remember. And there was this enormous wardrobe that, I don't know, it looked like the most exotic piece of furniture I've ever seen. Could have been carved out of a redwood or something. It was just, it was beautiful. And he opened the doors, and there were all the Beatles suits in there. There were Shea Stadium, and there were the black suits with the velvet collars, and the silver suits with the black velvet collars, and there were 3 Sgt. Pepper jackets. And we started trying on all these clothes, all right? Just pulling them out, and there was loads of other stuff, all Beatle wear. And we were putting them on, and I said, well, Sgt. Pepper ones, let's take a look at those. And he brought them down. He only had 3. And we were putting them on, and it was the strangest thing, because they were so small. And George said, like, I haven't got that much bigger, have I, since the Beatles? And I said, no, I don't think so. And these things were tiny. And we were trying them on, and he said, I think that one's Paul's. He said, but don't tell him I got it. You know, he doesn't know where it is, but I've got it, and I'm going to keep it, sort of thing. But jokingly, in the best of humor, you know.
You mean the blue one that Paul wore?
Yeah. And so there we were trying on these jackets, and it was quite a bizarre experience. Eventually, I got back home, I guess must have been early hours of the morning, and I went to bed, and guess what? I couldn't sleep. I'm sure you can imagine. So it was a really surreal night, and it was just me and George in the whole house, just goofing off, having fun. He knew that doing something like that to me, just for me, to have a bit of fun, would be something I could tell a story about one day, which is exactly what I'm doing now.
Hi, my name's Paul Tennant, and in 1967 I stood outside these gates that belonged to the house of Paul McCartney, who still lives there, and me and my friend Dave Rhodes, 2 aspiring songwriters from Liverpool, stood here in the hope that we were going to meet him. When we stood outside the house here, there was lots of girls all around the place. We knew it was Paul McCartney's house. And we stood here talking to the girls, hoping that we were going to get a chance to at least wave to him or something. When all of a sudden his car, a small mini, shot through the gates. Paul drove out. He was sitting in the back with his sheepdogs at his side, Jane Asher driving. And off they went. They drove straight down the road. Well, Dave and I decided to go in hot pursuit. We ran across the road, jumped into our car, and off we went. Chase all across London, down through Paddington, up that way through Hyde Park, Baker Street, hanging onto his tail, jumping red lights, all kinds of things. His mini stopped. He got out with Martha the sheepdog and started to walk across the park. Well, we didn't know what to do, So all we just did was abandon our car, and literally abandoned it, and went off in hot pursuit after Paul across the park. Well, we collared him and said to him, Paul, can you help us? We're two songwriters in Liverpool and we need to try and get a break. Well, after about 5 minutes of telling him this and telling him that, he just wrote down a phone number and said, give that guy a call, he'll help you.
If I promise to love you.
The guy was Terry Doran, managing director of Apple, and we became the first guys signed to Apple. Brian Epstein gave us the name Focal Point. John Lennon loved our records. We got a record deal, came down to London to live. They got us a place in Highbury, and we spent a year from 1967, 1968, the famous Summer of Love, with the Beatles, mixing with all kinds of people. We had a fantastic time. And all I want to say is, Paul McCartney, thanks very much. Good on you, man.
Then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer.
I met them, actually I met them naked. I was way into my hippie mode and just totally overwhelmed with it. This would have been 69. Ringo and George came to my house to visit and to play. Steve Stills was there, I introduced them. I had a jam room and there were drums and we played together for a while. Stephen and George and Ringo and I just wandered around naked all the time. Ladies swimming nude in the pools and, and they said, oh, this is embarrassing, you better get dressed for me. So I went and got dressed.
Speaking of monkeys, in 1974, a 3.2 million-year-old skeleton was discovered in Ethiopia, the oldest link to our beginnings as humans. The skeleton, which caused a worldwide sensation, was known as Lucy.
When I got back to camp and announced this discovery, everyone wanted to come out and see it. So we delayed lunch, we went back, we saw the area. That night we celebrated the discovery. And with a tape playing with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in the background, the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds came up. And I had a girlfriend on the expedition. Her name was Pamela. She said, why don't you name her Lucy after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds? And I thought, I'm a scientist. I don't give cute little names to my fossils. This has to be an Australopithecus. And I didn't think much of it. And the next morning, my students at breakfast said, are we going back to the Lucy site? You think there's more of Lucy's jaw there? How tall do you think Lucy was? How old do you think she was when she died? And it was unstoppable. Today, she has become an icon in the field of human evolution. She represents the oldest, most complete adult specimen of a human ancestor that's ever been found. She got that name, it stuck, and that's how everybody knows her 3.2 million years after she died.
Cass was in love with John Lennon. I mean, she had this thing for John Lennon that was otherworldly. We're all on a trip to England, and Cass couldn't go out that night. Leave me alone, I gotta go to bed. And everybody went off on the town. And I wound up in this place called Dolly's, and in comes John Lennon and party and sits down at the next table. And I look at him, and he looks at me, and we both go, aren't you? And he looks around the room and goes, we are, aren't we? I asked him if he had any smoke, any marijuana. He made a phone call to the studio, and he called Foley. Well, I just remember I called Foley. So McCartney shows up at this place, and one thing led to another, and I said, you got to come back to the house. You got to meet somebody. Cass, love to meet you.
And they came back to the house, and Danny was telling me that he ran upstairs and went, Cass, John Lennon's downstairs. And she went, no way. And he went, yeah. And she was downstairs in like 5 seconds.
When Cass and Lennon are just talking and laughing and singing and telling jokes and carrying on, heads together in front of the fireplace. And she spent, I guess, from like 1 until dawn, 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, fulfilling her biggest fantasy in life, which was just sitting having a oneness with Lennon. It was just, she had a great time.
when the Beatles were doing the Magical Mystery Tour, I think they were in Devon, England, essentially. And they went to the Atlantic Hotel, eventually got there. I was already down in the West Country. So I called over, and Mal Evans answered the phone, and I said, what are you guys doing? What's going on? And Mal said, we're having a Magical Mystery Tour, and the boys would like you to come over. So I went over with wife and 2 daughters and spent the day when they were filming outside by the swimming pool, outside in the Atlantic Hotel. That's how we ended up on the cover of the Magical Mystery Tour.
Boy, that's pretty iconic to be on the cover of that.
After the hard day's shooting, I trooped into the downstairs bar, followed by Ringo, followed by Paul, and the locals just went, did a double take. And Paul immediately, this gift he has of breaking the ice, says, I'm the pub piano player, and tonight we're going to sing pub songs. So he proceeds to get a pint of beer, sticks it on the piano, and thumps away playing pub songs. And all the locals join in. I do like to be beside the seaside. Remember that song? I do like to be beside the sea, and all the rest of it. Whatever pub songs there were, Paul pulled them out. I mean, he was great. As I say, Ringo just one after the other. And I'm not quite sure how it ended. I think I just went upstairs and collapsed. But it's been a hard day's day, and then into the evening.
Diana Varro was one of Brian Epstein's secretaries in the heady days of 1964 and 65, when Beatlemania hit the world. Even though she worked for the Beatles, she was not immune to their charisma.
I probably had worked there about a month before the first Beatles concert I went to. Of course, it was packed, and so I stood in the back next to Brian, and all the girls were screaming, and all of a sudden you find yourself at age 19 or whatever, screaming along with the girls. It was like getting caught up in the moment, But I did actually scream, and all of a sudden my girlfriend kind of nudges me and said, Brian's over there, And I mean, I didn't scream like for a really long time. It was like one time, and then I immediately put myself back into the, this is not appropriate for me to be doing this. It was the first time I did that and the last time I did that in my whole life. I probably had worked there about a month before they left for America to go to the Ed Sullivan Show. And that was the very first time that I actually met the Beatles. They had a chauffeur-driven car, which took them everywhere. And I went in the car to the airport. I didn't go on the trip to the Ed Sullivan Show, but I went in the car to the airport with the Beatles, with the 4 Beatles, Brian Epstein, and their road manager, Neil Aspinall. That was the first time I met them, and it was quite exciting for me being 18. John was nice. I mean, he was always really nice to me, but actually the person that affected me most of all in that particular car trip was Paul. They were all kind of kidding around and everything. And Paul said, Diana, I want you to take a letter. And, of course, I didn't have notepads or anything with me at the time. All I had was my purse and maybe a pencil in there. I said, well, yeah, and he said, I've got this friend in Liverpool, and he's really sick. I can't remember what it was. It seems to me that it possibly was some kind of cancer. But he said, I want you to take a letter to this guy and just tell him how much we're thinking about him at this time. And I just thought that's just something I've remembered about Paul, that it was really nice of him to think about this friend of his that was sick as they were exploding, getting ready to explode onto America. And, we were all very young at the time. I mean, they were in their early 20s. I was 19. I thought that was really, really nice of Paul.
Do you remember where you were when you first actually heard the Beatles' music?
Well, I remember hearing Please Please Me for the first time. I was in, my parents, was still living with my parents. I was in the kitchen. But when I heard Please Please Me, it was a religious experience, or the nearest what I imagine a religious experience to be. Just the sound of those voices and the echo and the bass drum and the bass and just the guitar and the whole thing. It was just the song. It was just brilliant. I thought That's it. This is the way it's going to be. When I heard, I saw her standing there, when I heard the count-off, the greatest count-off in history for me, it was like, start your life now. He's counting me in. It only got better and better, didn't it? And I remember the nervousness about when the Beatles put a new single out or an album, it was kind of like my record. So I would listen to it and go, shit, that's good. And we'd all listen to it, all my mates. It's not as good as this one. It's not as good, it's not as good. It's too, I know, it's too bluesy. Then put it on again. All right, put it on again. Bastards. Done it again. You know, it was like that. They belonged to us, you know. They were like, they represented everything that was great about music and being alive, and just such an inspiration. I just thank them for everything.
From the beginning, I mean, one of my favorite albums was the Beatles' second album. They were really strong. Everything was sung loud, strong, and brash. Even the cymbals were like just crashing all the time. And years later, I took acid because of the Beatles, of course. Took acid, took LSD, and realized, had this great moment of realizing why I felt so strong every time I heard a Beatles song, early Beatles song. And it was because the cymbal sound, everything, the record's very compressed, you know, and that's a type of effect. And back then they overused it mainly because it was easier to get some volume out of the thing without making the record skip and stuff. So a lot of people just used compression. But when Ringo would play his ride cymbal or his sizzle cymbal or open hi-hats, there was this constant sound of shh, and like Hard Day's Night, it's going all the way through it. It's just this sort of shh sound. And that was the sound of Superman flying. From when I was a kid, every time he would jump, he would shh, and that's why I always had this feeling of, as soon as I heard that Superman sound and this brash vocals, I just felt like this was just soaring above everything, and they were singing like without, it was the opposite of insecure or trepidatious, or it was just a joyous, ringing, loud, irreverent, and pretty sound, you know, with the Superman flying throughout.
As a fan, do you have a favorite song that they ever did?
Yeah, yesterday.
While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
This way.
Day Tripper.
Probably Strawberry Fields.
All You Need Is Love.
8 days a week.
Martha, my dear.
We Can Work It Out.